Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to Moravian Hall Square on this beautiful spring day. I don't know if anybody else here is suffering the way I seem to be suffering with allergies this year. I think it looks beautiful, but I can't sit in it for too long, unfortunately. But so welcome to Moravian Hall Square today. We're thrilled to have you here. This is our Eventful Living program. We've been doing the Eventful Living series for a number of years now. In fact, this year we at Morning Star Living are celebrating our 35th anniversary. We haven't been doing Eventful Living for quite that long, but we have been providing some seminars and entertainment in some form or other for many of those 35 years. So we're doing a lot of fun things this year to help celebrate that anniversary. So hopefully you'll be able to join in some more of those celebrations as the year progresses. Now, a couple of housekeeping items. Restrooms are just outside here in the hallway. Gents is carry corner to this room here. Ladies is off to the right and on your left. And then the other one thing, if I can ask everyone to silence their cell phones. We never used to have to worry about cell phones. Jeff, do you have your cell phone silenced? Alrighty. If we can make sure they're silenced, because you can bet the one that rings, the person is the one that doesn't recognize their own ringtone. That's usually what happens. And everybody else is looking and waiting and they're oblivious. So let's make sure they're all silenced before we start. Now today we are thrilled to have with us Jeff Ryan. He has come down from Maine. He came down last night. He's staying overnight in our guest house. He's assured me he had a comfortable night, which is great. And he's been with us a couple of times before in the past, but not for quite a number of years, certainly not since pre-COVID. And he has written a wonderful new book called This Land Was Saved for You and Me. And he is really going to talk to us today about how the public lands came to be in public hands. So please put your hands together in welcome to Jeff Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you. With any luck, this is working. Am I loud enough? No? A little more volume? Okay. There we go. Better now? Can you hear me in the back? Great. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming in from this beautiful spring day to learn more about our great outdoor surroundings in the United States and how they came into being. My name is Jeff Ryan. I came down from Maine. I'll give you just the really quick background of how I came to write the book, and then we'll cover about a century of history in about 40 minutes, so strap in. I came to love public lands from a very young age, and as I got a little bit older, I had the opportunity to hike from Mexico to Canada. This is me in 1983 in Washington State with hardly a shaved hair on my head. I did not shave for the entire trip, as you can probably tell. That's the trail running down below me there, and what I love about this photograph is I scrambled up to that ridge top after dinner to see what the view was like. So only me, my friends would say, would hike about, at that point, about 2,000 miles only to run up to the top of a mountain. I claim that this is one of the first selfies ever taken. After I got back from that trip, I went back to Maine and promptly, inadvertently started hiking the Appalachian Trail with a friend. We didn't realize we were actually doing the trail for about 3 years. We were hiking in Vermont on a trail called the Long Trail that went the length of Vermont, north to south. And one night my friend said, "You do realize we're hiking the Appalachian Trail, don't you?" And I said, "You must be kidding. It's going to take us 30 years at this rate." And he said, "So what?" And probably the two most influential words in my life, so what indeed. It took us 28. And so I finished that trip in 2013 and set off to write a book about it, which is called Appalachian Odyssey. Each chapter in the book is about a different trip. Just a quick housekeeping thing. We did not do it linearly. We smorgasborded it, as we would say. Every year we'd say, it's your turn. What state do you want to do next? And we'd say, let's do part of Pennsylvania, let's do part of Virginia, let's do Maryland, et cetera. So that's how we did it. So I wrote Appalachian Odyssey, and then my first foray into history of public lands was a book about how the Appalachian Trail came into being called Blazing Ahead. The trail was the brainchild of a fellow named Benton Mackay, this man here, who saw the trail very slowly taking off, but not really gaining the traction they needed to get it built. Enter a young upstart from Lubec, Maine, called Myron Avery, who rolled up his sleeves and project managed the thing to completion in the 1930s. So that was my second book, which led me to write others, and now I'm on number 6. I've always had this fascination, as I said, with the more I appreciate public lands, and I've hiked almost 10,000 miles now on public lands, mostly within the United States. I've developed a very strong appreciation for the people who made these places possible. In fact, I would not, or anyone would not have the ability to enjoy them were it not for these individuals. So I started going to the places where they grew up. I wanted to see what effect the places they grew up in had on their becoming advocates for public lands. This is northern Minnesota, where a fellow named Ernest Oberholzer lived for several years, decades as a matter of fact, and he was responsible, single-handedly responsible, for saving 75 million acres of wilderness areas. Mostly the Boundary Waters Wilderness area, the Quetico Superior area in the upper Midwest and into Canada, and also Voyageurs National Park. So I went to his house. Aldo Leopold, famous conservationist, was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society, and he wrote a book called A Sand County Almanac about rehabilitating a farm in Wisconsin. And this is the chicken coop that he and his family bought in the 1930s. It was the only thing remaining on this hardscrabble farm, and they rehabilitated the land. And there's Aldo sitting out in front of their chicken coop, rehabilitated into a family cottage, where he wrote most of A Sand County Almanac. And then finally, near and dear to our hearts in this room, I imagine, is Gifford Pinchot's house, family house in Milford, Pennsylvania, just a little bit, about an hour or so north of here, at the north end of Delaware Water Gap. And there's Gifford himself, first head of the Forest Service, twice governor of Pennsylvania. We'll be talking about him. So I started looking at having accumulated about 8 or 10 years worth of stories about some of America's great conservation heroes. And I started putting together what I hoped would be a finding your roots kind of approach to conservation history. What I found out was the roots got very tiny and very hard to follow after a while. There were so many overlapping people and events and stories that I needed to simplify it. What I came up with was that basically over 100 years, the common denominator was a series of 3 conservation baton passes, as I call them. And the first passer of the baton was a fellow named Frederick Law Olmsted, a famous landscape designer. In fact, the first preeminent landscape designer in the United States. He passed the baton to Gifford Pinchot, and Gifford Pinchot passed the baton to a young band of upstart foresters who ended up taking the next baton pass, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So to start with, I want to talk about Olmsted, who's often not recognized as being a contributor to the conservation movement, but he was a very, very influential man for many reasons. His 200th birthday was last year, as a matter of fact. So he is. So what's really interesting to me about Olmsted, and I think probably because I consider myself something like him in terms of how we learn, he was largely self-educated and a generalist. He spent a lot of time as a youth being out in the outdoors, exploring carriage roads, going on carriage rides with his family. And he says that those trips really imbued him with a feeling that scenery was the most important thing. It was very important for our health and for our well-being. And cultivating scenery and an interest in scenery was in him as a very young man. He was taken not only around the Hartford area where he was born and raised on these trips, but his family took him as far away as Franconia Notch, Niagara Falls, Quebec, and other areas which are pretty far-reaching to get to on horseback or carriage back in the day. This is what Niagara Falls would have looked like when he first saw them at age 12. Very influential in his life. As far as formal education goes, he really didn't have any. From age 3 to 14, he was just sort of a mishmash of schooling experiences. And what's really interesting is that one biographer said, even as a small boy, he was treated as if he was an orphan child. His father was a self-made man, a very rich merchant, and felt that his son should be self-made as well. So he did not place a premium on education. What's really interesting about this is the second son, his younger brother, went to Yale, and his father thought that schooling was critically important to child number 2, but child number 1 needed to show that he could make it on his own. So at age 14, he tried his hand at going to Yale, but he fell into a patch of poison sumac, which was so bad that his eyes were actually blinded for a time, so he gave up on going to Yale. He dabbled in surveying for a time. He audited Yale at age 18, and at this point, he knew enough about formal education to know that he didn't want anything to do with it, that he wanted to learn from experiential learning. So at age 21, he decides he wants to become a merchant marine. He goes to China and back, but it was a long enough trip for him to decide that by process of elimination, that wasn't what he wanted to be. So a year later, he announces to his father he wants to become a fruit farmer, and that didn't work out either. He sold the fruit farm to his brother, and in 1857, after a time when he was trying to be a successful author and was to a degree, he bought into a publishing house and it went bankrupt. He was writing his 4th book, reading the manuscript as a matter of fact, when he got the telegram saying that the publisher had gone bankrupt. We failed today. And he was very distraught. He was sitting in a hotel drinking tea in the lobby of a hotel in Connecticut when, fortuitously enough, an old friend of his named Charles Eliot walked in and said, "I can't believe this. I was just thinking about you. There's a job in New York City as a superintendent for a new park, and you'd be perfect for it." So that night, he got on a ferry and went to New York City, and he became the superintendent of Central Park. He and Calvert Vaux, who was a cathedral designer in Europe, designed the winning design for Central Park, called the Greensward Plan. And the whole thing about Olmsted at this point was his revelation that he was bringing nature to people. This was building a park in an urban environment, and he felt really strongly about the mental and physical well-being aspects of providing a natural place for people to come who lived in the city. He wanted them to be able to sit under trees, to go for long walks. So emphasizing nature was what he brought to the party in designing the park, minimizing the man-made. If you sit in Central Park, a lot of the roads, there are 6 crossroads crossing Central Park. They are all underground. They're under eye, so it looks like you're looking across a giant field. This was all Olmsted's doing. He wanted it to feel like you were in nature, not in an urban environment. And he said in the plan, the freedom and repose which will be refreshing and tranquilizing to the visitor coming from the confinement and bustle of crowded streets. And this was an amazing quote that I found. So he's looking at Central Park being built with Calvert Vaux. He's looking around, and the tallest building he can see is 3 stories high. And he turns to Calvert Vaux in 1858 and says, someday this place will be surrounded by tall buildings. How right. So he has a falling out with the keeper of the purse at Central Park. He wanted to do even more grand designs, and they kept pulling the reins in on certain aspects of it, and he got fed up. So he went and worked as a person coordinating bringing supplies, medical supplies to the front in the Civil War. And then after he set them up for success, he got a job offer to run a gold mine in California at the salary of $10,000 a year, which was an amazing amount of money in 1863. And oh, by the way, he owed his dad about $10,000 from buying the fruit farm that had failed and owing the publisher that went belly up. So he thought, I'm going to go out and give this a try. So he's going to be able to pay back his father. And during his time there, he goes up and sees the redwoods in the Mariposa Grove at Yosemite, and he is absolutely stunned at what he sees, this beautiful scenery. When he gets back to the gold mine, which he has already decided he's going to quit, there's a letter waiting for him saying that the state of California is about to be given Yosemite as a state park by Abraham Lincoln. He's going to cede the land to the state of California. Would Olmsted come up with a plan for managing this great resource? And keep in mind, this was at a time when hardly anyone was out there, in a manner of speaking. There weren't a lot of people out there. And so once again, Olmsted looked into the future and saw a time when Yosemite would be quite popular indeed. He wrote up a plan called the Mariposa Report for Yosemite, and he highlights again why we need scenery. We need it particularly for the contemplation that occurs to give us relief from ordinary cares. It is favorable to our health and vigor, especially that of the intellect beyond any other conditions that can be offered them. But it not only gives pleasure for the time being, but increases the subsequent capacity for happiness and the means of securing it. Again, incredibly profound. He's saying that once we have seen the awe of nature, it's with us forever, and we will try to relive it, whether we can actually be in nature or only in our mind. Ideally, we can be there in person. He also, interestingly enough, says what happens if we don't have access to nature, which includes mental disability, softening of the brain, palsy, monomania, and insanity. So he wants us to consider what happens to us if we don't have nature around us. So that was Olmsted's fundamental picture in developing this awareness of why we need nature in our midst. Not only natural places that are natural of their own accord, but building natural places if that's not possible in an urban environment. as they did bringing 500,000 trees into Central Park. So Olmsted was a major contributor, and we'll see how he continues to run this thread. There were also some lesser known contributors at this point in time. While Olmsted was advocating for scenery, others were considering the state of forests for various reasons. George Perkins Marsh being one of them, Franklin Benjamin Huff another, Reverend Julius Ward of New Hampshire and Maine, and natural devastations that were happening as a result of forestry practices were causing people to reconsider why we should be taking care of our forests. So first I'll talk a little bit about George Perkins Marsh, so unheralded. In 1864, this fellow who was living in Vermont, who actually would end up becoming a diplomat and a lawyer and a professor, among other things. But first and foremost, he saw the damage that was taking place as the result of clear-cutting forests around his home, his community. Clear-cutting was a common practice then. There was a feeling that forests were inexhaustible and we should just continue to cut them down. It was at the same time the country was being built out, so there was a huge demand for lumber products. So legitimately there was a reason why people were cutting trees down at such a rate, but no one seemed to be considering what was left in the wake of all of this cutting, and they just kept moving west and cutting in front of them. And in the case of New York, particularly in the Adirondacks, there were tens of thousands of acres that had been clear cut and no taxes were paid. The lumbermen just absconded and left the state holding the bag. So Marsh writes a book called Man and Nature in 1864, and it has an amazing impact on the history of conservation. He was the first environmentalist to discuss the interrelationships between environment and culture. And as Stuart Udall once said, it was the beginning of land wisdom in this country. What are we doing to the land? Why is it important to manage it? Why is it important to have places that are set aside for all of our benefit? Why is it important to have forest lands managed so that the crops can be harvested and sustained? So just a snapshot here. This is what the virgin forests in America were like in 1620. By 1850, you can see it disappearing. And by 1920, almost all the virgin forest is gone. Just those little dots are left. So a lot of it had been clear cut, and it was time to put a stake in the ground if not all of it was going to be lost. So in 1864, we have Marsh saying, let us restore this one element of material life to its normal proportions and devise means for maintaining the permanence of its relations to the fields, meadows, and pastures, to the rain and dews of heaven, to the springs and rivulets with which it waters down the earth. So he's making a connection between the health of the forest and our health, and the health of the environment at large. So the book took off. It really sort of hit a note with a lot of people, and it was second only to Darwin's On the Origin of Species for its impact on contemporary thought. And it changed the history of forestry. In particular, there were two people that read this book that took the initiative to do something about our forests. The first, a hardly known person in this day and age, is a fellow named Franklin Benjamin Huff. Huff grew up in upstate New York, just west of the Adirondacks, so he was aware of what was happening there, or would happen there. He attended Union College and then became an MD in 1848. But in 1852, he quits his medical practice to become an author and a historian. And this was really neat. In 1862, he published the first journal of forestry. Unfortunately, there were not enough subscribers. So it did not last for more than a year, but he gave it the old college try. He worked for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was the outfit that Olmsted was working for during the Civil War, and undoubtedly got to know Olmsted personally during that period. And then in 1855 and 1865, he was hired to oversee the New York census, and it was that 10-year period where he went, oh my gosh, what are we doing to the forests? He saw an alarming decline in timber. Then he reads Man and Nature. He puts two and two together. He serves on the New York Commission to review the devastation that's happened already in the Adirondacks and what to do about it. And then he comes to Portland, Maine, my hometown, to deliver a paper called On the Duty of Governments and the Preservation of Forests at an American Association for the Advancement of Science. In it, he makes four key cases. One is that timber is in fact essential to our well-being economically and mind and spirit, but we cannot continue doing what we're doing. It's unsustainable. The forests need to be managed, and interestingly enough, in 1873, he says we need forestry schools, of which there are none, and will not be for several more decades. 1876, he becomes a special agent to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to assess the state of forests and lumber in the U.S., and he spends a year traveling the U.S. on his own dime, writing a 650-page report for Congress describing everything from land misuse to seed gathering, planting techniques, and even recommendations for a forestry school curriculum. And then in 1881, he's named the chief of the newly created Division of Forestry. So he was in fact the first head of a forestry division, not our beloved Gifford Pinchot, as many of us have come to know. But James Pinchot, Gifford's father, was also influenced by Man and Nature, the book. The Pinchots had arrived in Milford, just north of here, in 1819, where James's father purchased 400 acres of land and promptly clear-cut it. They operated a store as well, but speculating in lumber became what brought them into wealth, and James was bothered by that. He saw what had happened from cutting all the trees down, so he scooted to New York to find his own fortune, and boy, did he succeed. In 10 years, New York City grew from 500,000 to 814,000, and all these opulent hotels were being built, and James Pinchot became an importer of fine French wallpaper. He made millions. In fact, so much so that he could retire young. He was socially focused and socially connected, of course, in part due to the fact that he was hobnobbing with all these hoteliers. And he also met Richard Morris Hunt of Bennington, Vermont, who became the architect of the Statue of Liberty pedestal, Gray Towers, which is the Pinchot estate, and the Biltmore estate, the largest estate ever built for one family in the United States. So he is working on bringing the Statue of Liberty to America and gets Richard Morris Hunt involved and builds the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. And this is their summer residence, and James's retirement project called Gray Towers. What's fascinating to me about this is it only has 3 turrets, not 4. They did not want to impugn the family, the Lafayette family, of whom they designed the residence after, so they only put on 3 turrets, not 4. There is a bust of Lafayette on the front of it. So James is 44 years old and building this house, and he marries Mary Jane Eno, who is also from a wealthy family, so they're doing okay for themselves. And they decide they're hiring this fellow named Frederick Law Olmsted to do their grounds around the estate, which if you ever get a chance to go there, it's awesome, doesn't even do it justice. So at the time, Gifford's but 1 year old, and James retires and sets his sights on how do I make a difference in America. And he gets his hands on a copy of Man and Nature, a first edition copy, as a matter of fact. This is the one under glass at the Pinchot estate. And he reads this quote, "The improvement of forest trees is the work of centuries. So much more the reason for beginning now." And this really resonates with James and figures, I don't have the bandwidth to take on reforesting America, but I know just the person to do it, my son. So he sets out to engineer a career for Gifford, which Gifford is quite enthusiastic about. Even before he enters Yale, class of 1889, his father asks him, "How would you like to be a forester?" To which Gifford replied, "What is that?" So he says later on, it was an amazing question to ask. I did not understand the import of it till much later. He goes to Yale. He tells his incredulous friends there he's going to become a forester. It will become his life work and it will change history. And they don't know what he's talking about. There he is. He's also assured by a professor that there is not a single American forestry school in existence. And instead of taking that as a roadblock, he writes home to his father, "This is amazing. I shall not only have no competitors, but even a science to found." So he had chutzpah, and boy, did that come in handy. So at age 21, he gets his own copy of Man and Nature, signed, and he's set off to make forestry his career with a great boost by his parents, who send him to France and Germany to learn forestry, which he stayed for 18 months and felt like he learned everything he needed to learn. He was going to come back to America and set the world on fire, metaphorically. And no one was ready to hear what he had to say. So he spent a couple years kind of bumming around and trying to get jobs through basically connections that his father and others had. And he couldn't get anywhere. And so he gets a few consulting jobs, bides his time, and oh, guess what? Mr. Olmsted enters the picture again. In 1888, Olmsted had been summoned by George Vanderbilt to come to this estate that he had bought in North Carolina with several tens of thousands of acres of clear-cut land around it. And he was alarmed and said, "What do I do?" And Olmsted immediately saw the potential for restoring all of that forest and managing it for production. The only problem was it was too much for Olmsted to take on. By that point, as the preeminent American designer, landscape architect, he was way too busy. In fact, he was co-designing the World's Fair in Chicago in 1892 when he turned to Vanderbilt and said, "I have just the young fellow in mind to manage your 86,000 acres of forest." That young man, Mr. Pinchot. So Gifford Pinchot is hired, and he is setting out to prove the viability of managed forests to forest owners, private at the beginning and ultimately public as they are established. His first job is to get the word out. There was no one who wrote more than Gifford Pinchot. The largest single collection in the Library of Congress is Gifford Pinchot. There are hundreds of thousands of letters that Pinchot wrote over his career. He also wrote articles for magazines like Garden and Forest, and he was hell-bent on teaching the American people what they needed to understand, what was at stake. And very importantly, his second job was to convince those in the forestry business that the job was not to prevent them from cutting trees, but to make smarter use of how they were doing it. As I said, it's the largest collection of material in the Library of Congress. He forges alliances very early on. He sees Teddy Roosevelt as a good ally. He starts working with him when he's the governor of New York. Hey, it would be a good thing if you listened to me on how to manage New York's forests, particularly the Adirondacks. So he was primed. By the time TR became initially vice president in 1900, he was lobbying for national forests, and then we all know where that went. Here they are standing on the presidential yacht discussing topics of the day and probably fishing too. One of the things that Pinchot really championed was the greatest good, the idea that decisions should be made in the public's interest based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people over the long haul. So he was very interested in making sure that decisions weren't made willy-nilly, but they were sort of considered within this framework. It became his mantra. He worked on commissions. He was really trying to make national forests a reality. He traveled all over the country on horseback and by train. He met John Muir and went hiking with him. And then he was still hitting roadblocks within the government. The foresters didn't want him to gain power because they thought they were doing just fine, cutting things on their own and not having any intervention from the government. So Congress threatened to pull the purse strings out from under this nascent, I lost the word there, division of the government that he was running, because he only had the ability to provide guidance, but he had no political power to do anything. So he figured, well, what I'm going to do is become indispensable to private landowners instead. If the feds won't listen to me, maybe I can be a resource for private forestry owners, which was a stroke of genius. He published a circular, number 21, he called it, to help farmers, lumbermen, and other private landowners manage their forests. He had no idea how popular it would be, but in the first year, lumber companies, farmers, and woodlot owners in 35 states were already banging his door down to try to get people to come out to their property and tell them what they should do with their forests. And then by 1904, he was getting really frustrated and said, I need to have control of the forest. There's only so much I can do. And so he holds an American forestry conference and invites friends and foes alike and says, what are your concerns about having national forest land be managed? And it worked. He invited all these people, and within 26 days of the conference ending, he had all these people on board, including Weyerhaeuser himself, and Roosevelt received the bill from Congress and signed it into law in 1904. And now 86 million acres of forest reserves were under Pinchot's control. He became the first head of the Forest Service and started hiring young upstarts to manage the forest lands, which is quite phenomenal to think that these newly minted foresters like Aldo Leopold here with his horse were being told at 22 years old, please go out to the Southwest and tell people that the rules for managing the forests have changed. Ingratiate yourself to the people and tell them that the rules have changed. And he felt strongly about giving them the right tools to do the job. So before he sent them out, he wrote a handbook with his minions called the Use Book. And they standardized policy for the conduct and service of all the officers and helped give them a boost when they needed it most. Some of the early foresters said there was no one like Pinchot. There was nothing like going out to your field post after all that inspirational training and knowing that you had the determination to do this, to forward the cause of conservation in the U.S. This was all Pinchot's doing. All of us who followed Pinchot were so impressed by what he stood for and his magnetic way of drawing men to him. Anything he said was right. There was no question about it. We followed him through fire and flood. So now we're ready for baton pass number 2, which is from Gifford Pinchot to these young foresters. So now I'm going to fast forward us to about 1934. And what we're finding is that the U.S. automobile has taken off in an unprecedented way. The growth of the automobile and the need for roads was starting to encroach on all areas, national parks, forest lands to a degree, and just what used to be the rural environment. And no place was it really more of an impact than skyline drives, which were now being proposed for 12 places in the United States. One of the people who was really put off by this was Benton MacKaye, the founder of the Appalachian Trail, because Skyline Drive was built over 34 miles of the Appalachian Trail, a footpath that he had established so that people could get away from it all was now being driven over by people trying to get away from it all. So in this quote, he says that the last one function of true wilderness is to provide a refuge from the crassitudes of civilization, whether visible, intangible, audible, whether of billboard, of pavement, of auto horn. All these are urban essences. They are all negations of wilderness. So what he and a handful of others were seeing was this potential impact of roads, and if we did not at least cleave out some lands to be roadless, we were headed toward not having any wilderness to enjoy at all. So this quick graph just shows the adoption of the automobile. We probably all know it, but to see it graphically, it's pretty amazing. This is the growth from 1910 to 1930. So we went from 3% automobile ownership to 50 by household in the US. So the Skyline Drives, as I mentioned, there were 12 of them being proposed. Obviously, Skyline Drive was one. The other ones, believe it or not, when we look back at it now, they wanted to build a Skyline Drive the length of the Massanutten Range, which is west of Shenandoah, going up through Virginia, over the entire White Mountain Range in New Hampshire, the entire Green Mountain Range in Vermont, 12 in all, some down in Georgia. And so MacKaye and his friends were alarmed. And MacKaye went to a forestry association meeting in 1934 and met with some fellow foresters that he knew there. One was Harvey Broom, who was, from Blue Ridge area. One was Bernard Frank, who was also a forester, and the most famous of them was a fellow named Bob Marshall. Ben MacKaye sat these guys down and said, what would you think if we started an organization that was against Skyline Drives? And Bob Marshall, who was in his young 30s at the time, I think he was 32, turned around and said, we shouldn't start an organization which is against anything. You should always start an organization that is for something. And so with that bit of genius advice, they started the Wilderness Society. They invited Aldo Leopold to come on board. Bob Marshall was obviously a smart choice. He was well-heeled, but he was also well-respected within the government. And Benton MacKaye, the granddaddy of the Appalachian Trail, were 3 of the first 8 members. The Wilderness Society had trouble getting traction in terms of making significant contributions toward establishing wilderness areas on a national scale. They were playing whack-a-mole with some dam projects that they successfully got stopped. One of them was Dinosaur National Monument, which they were going to build a big dam in and flood 1/3 of the desert. So they were able to make some inroads there, but they hired this fellow named Howard Zahnizer, who ended up being the absolute right person at the right time. It was funny because they thought he looked more like a librarian than a wilderness guy. I mean, these were hardy wilderness guys, and they were hiring this guy, and they thought, gee, I don't know. They were wrong. Mackay had proposed to the Wilderness Society's board that they focus the whole organization's work on creating a nationwide system of wilderness areas. And Zahniser spent 17 years making that happen. What's really important about this is that he did not see opponents as enemies. He sat down with people. His father was a minister. He learned a lot about sitting with people and learning their concerns and working with them over time. He was very patient. What's another really cool thing about Zahniser, this is the coat that he wore to work, rain or shine, and the reason why he wore this huge coat was that there are all these, he had a tailor custom make pockets on the inside. It's a walking file cabinet. And he had different versions of talking points for the wilderness bill inside his coat so that when he met someone in the halls of Congress, he could pull out the right version and give it to them and say, this is why wilderness is important to you and your constituency. He would also carry a slide projector or a movie projector. His movies he would show in the halls of Congress, and he would literally have people crying for these beautiful vistas and places and saying we need to have these places saved for us and our children, our grandchildren. Over all those years, he went through 19 congressional hearings, 60 rewrites, scores of meetings. It just went on and on and on. The guy just basically, unfortunately, worked himself to death. Just two of the quotes from him. It has long been my opinion that wilderness preservation policies in this country cannot be firmly established and secure until those who might wish to make conflicting use of our wilderness areas have joined in developing such policies, and having done so are satisfied to accept them. So it wasn't enough to just get the votes. He wanted to get people's hearts and minds behind it as well. He didn't want the work to be undone just because someone put in a bill that was against it the next session. He wanted to build something lasting. And then he would say, why wilderness? Out of the wilderness has come the substance of our culture, and with that, a living wilderness, it is our faith that we will have a vibrant, vital culture, an enduring civilization of healthful, happy people who perpetually renew themselves in contact with the earth, hearkening all the way back to Olmsted's vision of why nature is so important. The Wilderness Act, 1964, unfortunately, Zahniser died in his sleep. His heart gave out. He was still a young man, but he had given it his all to make sure that the legislation would pass. He knew that it was going to. It in fact passed the full House as a vote of 374 to 1, and his son Ed told me, I said, who was the one vote? And his son Ed recently told me that when asked why he voted against the Wilderness Act, the House of Representatives representative said, I really didn't understand it. I didn't know what I was voting for or against. So it probably could have been 375 to nothing. It was signed into law in 1864. There's LBJ. We have Howard's wife, Alice, looking on, and it was quite an event. Hubert Humphrey is there as well. He was one of the sponsors of the bill. So as a result of that act, 9 million acres in 13 states were established, including Ernest Oberholzer's favorite, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area in Minnesota, where I took this picture, the Bridger Wilderness in Wyoming, the Bob Marshall in Montana. Marshall had passed away by then. Ansel Adams Wilderness in California. Today we have 112 million acres of lands. The wilderness areas, most of which were carved out within existing federal lands, so they're either parts of former national forests or national parks and wildlife refuges, in some cases Bureau of Land Management land. So today, just to recap, we have 423 national parks, 803 wilderness areas, and 154 national forests, plus an extra 20 grasslands. And my book, these are some of the things I didn't get into, more about the lives of Olmsted and Pinchot, the creation of the national parks, which didn't come up today, the political and economic realities of creating these places in real time, what were the concerns and the hurdles, and the question of preservation versus conservation. And that's it. So thank you. I have all my books here for sale too as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That
Not
was
bad, Liz.
A wonderful seminar. We learned so much today. And I think we certainly are blessed in this area when we have so many of these open spaces that are available for us to enjoy here in this local area. We have Jacobsburg State Park right here on our doorstep, and we have actually preserved a beautiful garden, historic garden out here behind our campus, a pleasure garden, which is a beautiful space for our residents to get that little bit of nature and that feeling of wellness as they stroll in the pleasure garden. So anybody got any questions today for Jeff? A lot of ground covered there. Can I give you the microphone if you don't mind?
Do you happen to know where the first forestry school was opened?
I do. It was actually a great question. The first forestry school was actually opened on the Biltmore estate. What had happened was Pinchot also got busy with side projects, and he hired a German forester to come over and run the forest, manage the forest there in his stead. And what ended up happening was what was going on in the forest there started getting national attention, and young men started showing up at the estate asking for pointers on how to manage the forest. And after a while, they said, oh, this is not just a one-off thing. They keep on coming. And so they started a forestry school there. And what was really interesting about that was Pinchot didn't like it. At first, he was fine with it, but because Pinchot didn't start it, and because Pinchot could not sort of dictate what and how things were taught, his father endowed Yale with $300,000 to start a forestry school at their estate in Milford. And Cornell got in there in between. Cornell was a very short-lived experiment. They got money to carve out part of the Adirondacks to create a forestry school, and their initial foray into it was an abject failure. They cut down some trees and replanted some that got destroyed in a harsh winter, and one thing led to another. Eventually the slash caught on fire there and started a big forest fire. Oh, and the summer residents there, of which included Bob Marshall's very well-to-do father, started complaining loudly, this is scientific forestry, you're burning the whole place down. And so that got the kibosh, and that gave an inroad for Pinchot's father to endow Yale. The first 20 years of the Yale Forestry School, which I believe it was 1900 or 1901, by agreement of founding this there, was held in Milford. The first several classes were held up at the estate. The recruits lived in tents up on the hill behind. They were managing the Pinchot forest. And then his father built a great big stone hall in the center of Milford, which is still there, one end of which was designed by Calvert Vaux, the old partner of Olmsted, and the other end was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the estate up on the hill. So it's still there. So that was really the first efforts into forestry schools.
Another question?
I just wanted to thank you so much. My father was a forester, and he graduated from Penn State in, I think, 1921, or at least the early 20s. And he worked for the U.S. Forest Service all his life. He started in Vermont and then ended up in Florida, where he met my mother. And when he retired, he was in charge of the I think the 5 southern states in state and private forestry. But I've lived with, forestry all my life, and this was just so interesting because I love the national parks, but I did not realize the whole history behind it. So thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. There's a really fascinating book that Pinchot's grandniece wrote. This is a really short story, but she was rooting around in the archives in the Library of Congress and found this box, and it said Old Timers. And when she opened it, what she had found was when Pinchot was toward the end, it was toward the end of his life, about 2 years before he died, he wrote to 300 of his recruits, his young foresters, and said, could you write me letters, reminiscences of your early days in the Forest Service? And she almost fell over when she found this box. She compiled many of them, the most interesting ones, I guess. Men and women who were recruited to work in the Forest Service the early years. And it's just a fantastic book. What it was like to be sort of, here's a job, like Leopold was one of the people who contributed, and go out there and carve a lifestyle out there among people you've never met before and tell them that the government needs to work with you now. And the other thing is that there was a lot of pushback out west particularly, and there was a lot of dragging Pinchot's name through the mud. And what ended up happening is Roosevelt actually sent Pinchot out to a conference of the Western lumbermen, and he had to sit there for 3 days listening to him himself being called names. And he was introduced to the conference as the most evil man on the face of the earth. And he walked up to the podium and he said, whoever was generating all these ideas is basically not on the beam, because I'm here to help you do your job better, and also to help make sure that this job is there for your kids and their kids. And one of the reporters there that was writing about it said it was not only a gutsy thing to do, but he actually won over a large part of the audience in telling them that I'm one of you. I'm a forester. So we're all trying to do the same thing, and it really is insightful, and it's a great lesson, that all voices were heard and actually listened to and responded to, and we got a good result out of it. So,
in 1980, we sold our farm to Nature's Conservancy, and they protected animals, trees, vegetation. Were they in direct competition with the Forestry Service to do this kind of work?
They were not. The Forest Service is largely already federally owned lands, and so it's within the sort of, from my understanding of it, the only way that you can have private land become federal land is that it has to be given to the state first, and then the state needs to give it to the feds. So the Nature Conservancy is doing things, and other organizations like them are sort of living in a sphere outside of that. And what they're doing is working with individual landowners and making things like what you've done possible, which is wonderful. There's a big movement going on now, particularly in the upper Midwest, around prairie restoration, doing the same thing, trying to cobble together private landowners to save and/or restore prairie grass, which to a large extent has disappeared over the years. And the other thing that's happening, I think, is really interesting from a forestry standpoint, is I touched on it in my ending slide, but historically, in conservation circles, you were either identified, you were asked, are you a conservationist or are you a preservationist? Preservationist came from sort of the John Muir part of the equation of we should just carve out land and leave it alone. And then on the other side, you had people like Pinchot who were saying we need to manage the land so that it can be productive for subsequent generations. And there was a legitimate reason for both, but oftentimes they'd get sparring over the same land. What are we going to do here? And they'd fight each other, and sometimes they'd both lose. And so what's been happening now is there's a movement out of Vermont, which I think so far it's 70,000 or 100,000 acres. They've been able to pull private land into public ownership, and what they're doing is having the foresters and the preservationists work together. And what they're doing is they're taking a lot of clear-cut land and buying it for the cheap because there's nothing there growing. And they're figuring out how to manage it for future forests and also have it open to recreation at the same time. So they're not against each other anymore. They're working for a common good, and that's pretty inspiring, I think.
Another question?
This was a wonderful presentation, thanks.
Thank you.
A lot of this started because of the New York State and the Adirondacks, but the Adirondacks are not a national forest.
No.
Could you explain what the Adirondacks actually are?
The Adirondacks is the largest state conservation in New York. That is a whole interesting part of it. I have a whole chapter dedicated to the Adirondacks. So what had happened was, as I mentioned briefly, the vast majority of the Adirondacks have been clear-cut, and then they absconded. The lumbermen absconded, and the state was left holding the bag. All these unpaid taxes, tens of thousands of acres, almost 100,000 acres. And so what to do? Where are we going to recoup that money? Well, what happened was, while they were debating what to do with the land up there, the clear-cut devastation was happening on so many fronts. It was causing floods and it was causing droughts. And so what happened was this consortium of people started saying, we need to preserve it. We can't trust the lumber people to manage this anymore, so enough of them. And Pinchot was trying to tell them, no, it's changed. We don't do it that way anymore. And he couldn't get an audience. And meanwhile, they didn't have enough people to sort of put together a coalition to save the Adirondacks. It was mostly the people who were affected by living in the area. But what ended up happening was the merchants down in New York City started saying there's an economic impact here. If the Erie Canal is overflowing or underflowing, then we have no competitor to the railroad. So if we're getting goods to and from market, if we're getting raw goods in and shipping them out, and the railroad's the only game in town, we're going to have our prices jacked up. So the merchants started joining the groundswell to save the Adirondacks. And it was at that point where the sort of let's save the Adirondacks movement started and was ultimately successful. As I mentioned, the Cornell School's downfall was also kind of played a role there. They said, well, managed forestry doesn't work, so get them out of here. And so now it's a giant preserve, and basically was signed into law as a preserve never to be invaded or minimally invaded by human interaction. And that's why that's probably the largest preservation area, certainly in the East, maybe in America. So it was really interesting because the economic thing also came into play in Pittsburgh. There was a giant flood in 1901 that was because of clear cutting upstream. And the water just came flying down the rivers and flooded the city. And people started putting two and two together. In Manchester, New Hampshire, 6,000 people lost their jobs overnight because of the flooding caused by the White Mountain National Forest area being cut down. So the economic impact plays a big role in how these places were established in the first place. It's really an important part of the story.
One more question?
In 1970, my husband was very interested in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and he took our teenage son, and they flew out and landed, and then a guide was going to meet them on horseback, and so they landed at a Forest Service airstrip in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And I was just wondering if, we presumed it was for firefighting and other conservation that they had it. Do most of the forests have an airstrip for access?
They have either an airstrip or they have fire roads, which are in various states of being managed at any given time. But they need to have minimally taken care of dirt roads, and some of them have airstrips. It depends on how remote they are, but most of them are for firefighting. Some of them are used to get people out in rescue efforts if people get in trouble back there. But it's interesting. The second largest road builder in the United States is the Forest Service, and it's because they're cutting such roads. And for many, many years, the number one builder of roads was the national parks, which is a little bit oxymoronic, but you know, they were building roads to get into places like campgrounds and scenic overlooks and such, and so they were big in the road building business, particularly in the 30s and 40s and 50s.
Is Gifford Pinchot's mansion up in Milford still open for tours?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yes, it's a wonderful place
I
to
go there twice a year. I drive down from Maine. It's just a phenomenal place, just phenomenal. It's well worth it. You guys ought to take a bus trip up there.
I'm just thinking the same thing.
Yeah. There's a wonderful restaurant at the bottom of the hill, Apple Valley. It would be perfect. You can sit on the porch.
2 more questions.
Okay.
With all the knowledge from the forestry schools and everything, why are we still having these giant forest fires in California?
Wow, great question. Part of it is just the managing of the slash is not being what it should be. And we're also seeing the harvest is not being managed to the degree that it could be, should be. So we're having old stands that are tumbling over and causing dead wood on the ground that isn't getting out of there. And it's a lot of it is budget. You know, we need to see a vibrant forestry budget to make sure that those are being managed. And the other thing is back to the roads again. We see these cycles of funding where many, many years, in some cases decades, and this goes for forests and national parks, quite frankly, that basic block and tackle stuff that needs to be done gets not done, and the can gets kicked down the road, and it catches up with us. You know, one lightning strike for a forest that they didn't get around to clearing out or any of that stuff causes much more damage down the road than if we had just invested the money in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And this is our very, very, very last question.
Okay.
We learned about the first forestry school, but I was curious, how many are there today? And the enrollment figures, are they declining or advancing?
Great question. There are hundreds of them now. As mentioned, was Penn State's one of them. Enrollment's been really interesting. It had been declining for quite a while, and now it's picking up again. The pendulum seems to have swung back. This new generation coming out of high school and into college seems much more engaged. But as I write about quite often, there seems to be one or two generations there that adopted looking at the phone and the iPad and all that stuff. And my feeling is, back to Olmsted's insights, that part of the importance of being in nature is becoming an advocate for it and being comfortable in it. And I think, unfortunately, we saw a few generations there where a lot of people were sitting behind a desk or a screen and not having that tangible part of it. And all is not lost. A good friend of mine is executive director of a organization in Maine whose mandate is to start high school outdoor clubs, and they have found 300 schools so far within Maine. The gear companies, predominantly LL Bean, which is in my backyard, has provided the gear, and they provide the teachers with the curriculum and the training to get kids outdoors. So they're hiking, they're kayaking, they're snowshoeing, they're cross-country skiing. And the other thing that's happening, which I think is really cool, is the libraries in my area, and I think it's a growing thing, is they're letting people check out snowshoes and skis and backpacks and all that stuff, so that kids, there's no economic barrier to getting outside. You check them out like a library book, and it's like, go have fun. So that's a wonderful thing too. But I've been following that, and I see an uptick in the forestry school part of it. And boy, do we need rangers and rangerettes. We need it. So.
Wonderful. Alrighty, that's the end. We'll give Jeff a time to catch his breath now. He's been talking for quite some time. So please put your hands together one more time for Jeff Ryan. And also just be reminded that he has some books here. Please feel free to have a look and purchase if you feel inclined.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
My mother would say I hadn't stopped talking in 66 years. Thank you.
What was the name of the author of the book you said?